Welcome to Leading Teams in a Global Crisis. I'm David Rendell. Leading Teams in a Global Crisis. This is interesting because it's kind of coming full circle because I developed parts of this presentation initially in 2016 when oil prices had fallen dramatically uh, and Bahrain was hit very hard and the whole region was hit very hard by that drop in prices, and it was affecting the economy pretty severely. And so I happened to be in the area doing some other presentations, and we organized a last minute public presentation, and we did this topic, and it was very useful at the time. And when this global pandemic started, and obviously the same things are happening in the Middle East region that were happening in 2016 with oil prices falling dramatically, maybe even farther than they fell at that time. This was a perfect topic. In fact, I've done it for multiple groups just this week, and I haven't done this presentation since 2016. So it's interesting to be speaking to you all and working with EMIC because that's where this all started a few years ago. And I think that's a good reminder. And that's part of actually the point of the presentation. Just things go down and then they come back up, and things get bad and then they're good again. And then they get bad again. And we have to remember that cycle, remember that pattern, and behave differently in the good times so that we're ready for the bad times. And unfortunately, we tend to forget those lessons. And I'm just as guilty of this as anyone else. And so that's sort of the perspective of the presentation today, is that I want to challenge you all to lead differently, to think differently, to respond differently, and to be wary of, to be hesitant of kind of doing what everyone else does in a crisis and managing the same way everyone else does in a crisis, and assuming that those people must know what they're doing, or assuming that must be the only way to respond. So I'll give you one example that actually came up yesterday. There's a company in the U.S. in Washington called Gravity Payments, and what they do is they process credit card payments for small businesses all over the United States. And their CEO became famous a few years back for guaranteeing everyone a $70,000 a year salary. The lowest paid anybody was going to be in his company was $70,000 a year. And that really caused a lot of discussion. Will that work? Is that smart? Can you maintain a business that way? And sure enough, it did work, and it was very motivating to his workers, and the company was very successful. But small businesses aren't processing payments right now because small businesses aren't open, and people can't afford to go to those small businesses. And a lot of those small businesses are offering things that aren't absolutely necessary, and those are the only kind of businesses that are allowed to do business right now. And so they're really struggling. And they've already seen a dramatic drop in income. And what do we do when there's a massive economic crisis? We cut costs. One of the biggest costs that most companies have is employees. So we cut employees, we furlough employees, we lay off employees, we make employees redundant. In order to cut costs, we cut services and products and hours for our customers. And that's what people do. And so the easiest thing for him to do would have been to send 20% of his workforce home and tell them that he didn't need them anymore and that he couldn't pay them anymore. But instead, he had hours and hours and hours, almost 40 hours of meetings with different groups of employees to talk about the problem and what they could do. And the solution they ended up with was giving every employee a piece of paper and a form to fill out. And on that form, they were supposed to tell the company how much money they could live without, how much of their salary, how much of their pay they could live without for a period of time. And everyone was allowed to choose the amount that actually could work for their budget. It's sort of like the reverse version of some things that bands and other groups have done in the past, of kind of pay what you want, pay what you can afford, pay what you think it's worth. And except in this case, it was give up what you can, give up what you think you can afford to live without. And so that's an example of a creative response. He didn't just immediately cut things. He didn't just immediately reduce things. He didn't just say, well, I mean, no one can blame me. Everyone's cutting their workforce right now. I'll do the same thing. He looked for a different solution. And think about the loyalty that that will create on the other side of this, because things will turn around, things will improve, things will get better. And think about how his company will be positioned versus a company who sent a majority of their workforce home, and not to work at home. I don't mean that. I guess that's a euphemism, but sent, cut people's jobs. It's harder for those companies on the other side, because now they don't have that trust with their employees. They don't have that relationship with their employees. And so that's what I want. Differently than most people behave, so that we're set up better when things come back around. And let me just give you an example of how things come around. So in 2007, the Dow Jones Industrial Average on the U.S. stock market was at 14,164. I know that's not the only measure of financial, the only barometer of how the economy is doing in the world, but it's one measure, and it's a measure that's pretty widely known, and that's why I choose that. So, but then we had the global financial crisis, because of the misuse of mortgage securities, primarily in the US, but also all over the world. And we had a huge housing bubble, and it burst. And the Dow Jones Industrial Average went from 14,000 in 2007 down to 6,500 in 2009. That's a 54% drop over a 2-year period of time. And people were talking about the next Great Depression, and talking about the Great Recession, and talking about whether we would ever be able to come back from this. And we did come back, though. In 2013, the stock market was back up to the same levels that it had been at previously. And the economy was going well again, and people were making money again, and people had jobs, and unemployment had gotten very low, at least in the United States, and things were back to normal. Things were going well again, and they weren't just going well because between 2013 and 2016 they went up another 5,000 points to 18,312. And so let's just stop there for a second. What would you do differently? And think about that question. What would you have done differently in 2009 if you knew that in 7 years, the value of the stock market would triple? The value of investments you made in an index fund would triple. That opportunities would increase dramatically, and that things were going to be significantly better than they were even before the crisis. And that question becomes even more relevant as we look at 2019, where we hit a peak last year of 29,568, or maybe early this year. Just 3 years later, what if you knew that the economy would be doing 5 times better than it had been previously, that your investments would pay back 5 times what you put in at the bottom of the crisis? What if instead of selling in 2009 at the bottom of the crisis, what if you had been buying? What if you had been optimistic? What if you had been looking for opportunities? What if it had been putting time and effort and money into the business instead of trying to cut things as rapidly as possible? Now, some of you, and quite reasonably, might be saying, well, Dave, I don't have the money to make those investments at the bottom. And that's another point that I'm trying to make today. And it's something I'm guilty of as well. I don't do it perfectly as well. If we not only remember that things go up, but that things go down, then when things are going well, when it's 2009 to 2019, and in a 10-year period, the stock market goes from 6 to 29, what should we be doing? We should be putting money in savings. We should be coming up with contingency plans. We should be stockpiling cash. We should be looking for the next crisis, preparing for the next crisis, making sure we're ready for the next crisis, because then when the stock market goes down from 29 to 18, like it did over the course of March, you have the opportunity again to buy things on sale. You have the opportunity to make investments in your business when nobody else is. You have an opportunity to stockpile supplies, or to get favorable contracts with vendors who don't have anybody else to sell to. I heard a report just yesterday that the world is running out of places to put the oil because nobody needs it. I mean, the gas prices are incredibly inexpensive here in the United States. They're less than half of what they were almost a month ago, but I have no place to drive. But if you could buy that, and you could store that, and you could save that to sell when things turn around, you could make a lot of money. But how do you do that when you don't have any money either, when you're struggling too? And so that's part of what I'm trying to get us to think about here, is acting in different ways, not only when things are bad, but acting in different ways than everyone else when times are good. When times are good, people tend to, they're going to be good forever. They tend to feel optimistic. They tend to make big bets. And then when bad times hit, people go, what can you do? I mean, bad things happened and nobody could have expected it. One of the things that hopefully we can learn from today is that bad things will keep happening, and we need to be ready for those things when they do. And so one great illustration of sort of a lot of the things I want to talk about today is Elon Musk. Now, to be clear up front, I'm not saying Elon Musk is perfect or he's fantastic or you should be just like Elon Musk. For example, he doesn't believe in the importance of sleep, and he argues that you shouldn't be sleeping because there's more important things to do. I certainly don't live by that mantra. I think some of his ideas are silly, and some of his beliefs, and we'll get into that, are inaccurate. But his story is fascinating, and a lot of the things he's done are very impressive, and he's managed to have some real major successes in business and in leadership. And I think there's a lot we can learn from his story. And I listened to his biography a few years back, and it was really interesting. And so I want to just give you a brief overview of his business career, and then draw some lessons from it that'll kind of be our guide for the rest of the session. So he started with a company. He started a company called Zip2, and they were an early mapping company, and they made money by selling ads with local businesses, by showing them that they might be able to increase traffic to their businesses. And that was eventually bought by a larger company who wanted to merge that into their operation. And he made $22 million personally on that sale. He had partners, so that's not the total cost of the sale, but he made $22 million on that sale. And he didn't just say, okay, great, I'm a multimillionaire now. He took that money and he invested it in a new company, which eventually became PayPal, again, with a series of partners. And there's a lot of dispute over who was the founder and who was the most powerful or whatever. It doesn't matter. He was part of the company that became PayPal. And when he sold his interest in that company, he made $165 million. And then he started Tesla, the electric car company. And in 2016, when I was doing this presentation in Bahrain, the Model 3 was coming out, and it was the model for the people, the affordable model. And they were selling for $1,000 deposit. They were selling these cars, pre-selling these cars. You could put a $1,000 deposit down if you wanted one of these cars. And in 1 week, they sold 325,000 cars and received $1,000 deposit on all those cars. And he was sitting on $325 million. Now, let's just stop right there. That's not the way people sell cars. People don't sell cars with deposits. They actually build them first, send them to their dealers, and then hope people buy them and provide financing once people do buy them, where they almost don't even get paid even then, and they get paid over time. And instead, he pre-sold his cars so that he would have the capital to be able to make the investments that he needed to make to build those cars. And certainly he struggled to do that, and he struggled to fulfill some of those orders, and it took longer than he expected. And there's been a big learning curve there. And that's why I'm saying he's not perfect, but that's a very different way of doing things than what everybody else does. And that's a good model for us. How can we do things differently? And that'll lead into more of what I want to share later. But then he also started a company called Solar City, and he's involved in that with his brother. And he started another company called SpaceX. And this is different as well, because conventional wisdom is don't do more than one thing at a time. Don't run more than one company at a time. Stay focused. Don't get distracted. Don't be involved in too many different things. But putting rockets into space, definitely not using electric power, using combustion engines, is a much different thing than making electric cars, and a very different thing than mass producing solar panels. And so he's breaking the mold in a lot of ways. Very few people would be CEOs of 3 major and new companies, startup companies in new technologies all at the same time. And so he's breaking the mold in that way as well. And one of their breakthroughs is their ability to reuse these rockets. They've been able to successfully and repeatedly land the rockets back on Earth after launching them into space, which has saved them a tremendous amount of money in being able to reuse those parts and reuse that equipment multiple times instead of always having it be disposable. And we'll talk about that a little bit later as well. And so his net worth as of today, I just checked it this morning, is now up to $29.5 billion. Again, that's not something that you see. You see people cash out their businesses and then become an investor in other businesses that they don't run. But his continual reinvestment of his own capital, his own money into companies that he runs and that he controls, and continuing to work in those companies, even though he doesn't have to do that anymore, and he can make the money without doing it, is very, very unusual. And again, I think that model of things in individual is helpful for what we're talking about today. So there's 4 things I want to talk about today that I want to encourage you to do in order to be more successful while leading through a global crisis. And the first one is to be alert. To be alert. The second one is going to be brave. The third one is to be different. And the fourth one is to be inspiring. Be alert, be brave, be different, be inspiring. And I'm going to use his story and some other examples along the way to illustrate that. But the first one is to be alert. And so what I mean by being alert is not being complacent. What I mean by being alert is when times are good, remembering that times will get bad. What I mean is kind of being a little paranoid, being anxious, being worried, being afraid during good times, recognizing that things will get bad again. But also in the reverse of that, when things are bad, being optimistic, being positive, being hopeful, because you know things will turn around again and they will get better. But when they get better, then being alert. So what I mean by that is being able to look forward to the future, being able to remember the past, and we'll talk about that, being aware, alert, paying attention, instead of just focusing on the present moment. Be looking back, be looking forward, have a broader perspective, and be anticipating that future, be anticipating what's going to happen in the future instead of just having it catch you by surprise. And Elon Musk is a great example of this, even though I think his beliefs are a little out there. I mean, quite literally out there in space. He doesn't run SpaceX because he loves rocket ships and wants to be an astronaut. He runs SpaceX not even really to make money. He runs SpaceX because he believes we need to become an interplanetary species. And he believes that because he thinks that we're going to destroy our Earth to the point that it's going to become almost uninhabitable and we're going to need another place to go. That's a high level of alertness. That's a high level of paranoia. That's a pretty big concern that he has, and he has that concern at a much higher level than most people have. Even people who are concerned about climate change aren't ready to take off for Mars. And so his whole business is predicated on the belief that we have to be ready, not for the next economic crisis, but for a global climate crisis that's going to make our Earth so uninhabitable that Mars is a better option. Now, again, let me stop for a second. This is not Elon Musk worship, because I think that's outrageous. I think it's stupid, and I think it's ridiculous. For example, anything that you would do on Mars to make it inhabitable, because it's tremendously uninhabitable right now, any technology you use, any of the equipment that you would ship there at a very, very, very high cost, you could use on Earth. It's unlikely that even if we damage the Earth, it will become so uninhabitable that Mars is a better option. And even if Mars is a better option, the cost of transporting people and equipment to Mars to make it inhabitable makes doing those same things and using that same equipment here much more reasonable and much more relevant. So again, I'm not saying that the specific belief is one that I endorse or support, but it demonstrates an extreme level of what I'm talking about in a way that challenges the rest of us to not just be looking for the next economic downturn, but to be aware of big changes that we need to anticipate in this world. And one that we're seeing right now is the ability of viruses and germs to spread globally very, very quickly because of the interconnected nature of our world. And how are we going to handle that? And how are we going to be prepared for this sort of thing in the future? Another example of his beliefs that I don't subscribe to are his belief in aliens and things like that. So he has a very high level of alertness. Some would call it paranoia, but even if you don't go to that level, I think it's worth thinking about how can you be more alert, and how can you, what I really mean by this is be thinking about how can you predict the future, right? How can you predict the future? Not in a fortune teller sort of way, but how can you be a person who consistently tries to predict the future? And usually if I ask people, what would you do if you could predict the future? They want to know the lottery numbers, and they want to know what's going to happen on the stock market. If they could predict the future, those are the two things that they realize would make them successful. If I could predict the future, I would want to know the lottery numbers. I would find out what the stocks were going to be in the future, and I would make investments that would make me rich. That's what most people want to do if they could know the future. And what I want to show you today is there is a way that we can predict the future. Winston Churchill said, the farther backward we can look, the farther forward we're likely to see. And that's why I started this presentation by walking you through the last economic crisis and bringing you up to the point of the current economic crisis. And we can even look back to the dot-com bubble in the late 90s. We can look back at the effect that 9/11 had on at the very least on the US economy and on international air travel for at least a short period of time. The farther backward we can look, the farther forward likely to see. One of the things that people keep saying right now is that we're living in unprecedented times, and that's not actually true. We've had global pandemics before. The Spanish flu just 100 years ago. If you know your history, if you know what's happened in the past, you can predict the future. We've had precursors to this. We've had the swine flu, H1N1. We've had SARS. We've had MERS. We've had other global or potentially global pandemics that didn't cause the same amount of disruption, but had the potential to, and they were warnings. And instead of using those warnings to prepare, we, again, were somewhat complacent and didn't learn those lessons. So it may seem like an exaggeration, but we can quite literally predict the future when we understand the past, and we can look at the mistakes we made during the last downturn and try to not repeat those during the current downturn. We can make sure that when things are on their way up, we're behaving in ways that insulate us from what happened on the way down. And a good example of that working in real life is to think about telegraph lines back in the 1800s. They figured out a way to communicate over long distances, and you had to use dots and dashes and Morse code, but they put these lines across countries and over the mountains and under the oceans, and we had a worldwide ability to communicate with each other. And then somebody said, wait a second, if we could do this without the wires, and they developed wireless telegraphy. But then somebody said, well, wait a second, wouldn't it even be better if we could hear each other? If we could just talk to each other, wouldn't that be better? And people had phones in their homes, and now we had bigger lines and bigger wire went across trees and over the mountains and under the oceans. But then they ended up in our hands and ended up in our pockets. But then somebody said, well, wouldn't it be great if we could communicate more than just with our voices? What if we could send messages and send pictures and send videos and send information? And we use broadband cables and under the oceans. But then somebody said, wait a second, what if we could do it wirelessly? And now we have what we're all used to, which is Wi-Fi. And 10 years ago, when this was all happening, I saw this pattern and I thought, wait a second, what are the things that we still need cords for? And that's why this picture looks old and has a BlackBerry in it and a Kindle in it. But I said, wait a second, we still have to plug in our devices. And if the pattern is throughout history for the last 150 years for things to go from wired to wireless, then won't there be a time in the future where we'll have wireless electricity? And at the time, 10 years ago, we didn't have wireless electricity. We do on a very small scale now. And so when I told my wife, she laughed at me and she said, Dave, we have wireless electricity. It's called lightning, right? She thought what I was saying was ridiculous. She thought it was foolish. She didn't see the pattern. It didn't make sense to her. And to be clear, I'm not a scientist. I wasn't predicting wireless electricity because I knew it was physically possible or I knew it was scientifically feasible. All I knew was the pattern goes from wired to wireless, wired to wireless, wired to wireless. And I saw the future because I could understand the past, right? And now we have wireless charging. It's still in its early stages, but we realize that it's possible now. It's becoming more and more common. And if you understood, and at any point, if you saw that during phones, you could have invested in wireless phones back when that was a possibility. When the internet came around, you could have predicted that just like phones and telegraph, internet was going to become wireless, and you could have invested in that. You could have turned your business in that direction. You could have invested in stocks that were going to make that a reality. And the same thing with wireless electricity. And so that's just one example of how the farther backwards we look, the farther forward we're likely to see. What I want to help you see today is that we can predict the future by understanding the past. And one of the things we know from the past is things get bad and then they get better, and then they get bad again, and then they get better. And when we can see that pattern, we can say, wait a second, when things are good, I need to prepare for when things get bad. And now that things are bad, even if I didn't prepare, I want to behave in different ways so that when things get good again, I'm ready to take advantage of that. I'm ready to succeed when things turn around. Wireless electricity has come so far in some places that South Korea actually has electric buses, but those electric buses aren't connected to electric lines like you see in some places. The electricity runs under the roads, and this is one of the answers to a lot of people's concern about electric vehicles. Electric vehicles have limited range. And so if you are in the traditional car business and you say, nobody's ever going to really be that excited about electric cars because the range is bad, you have to realize that there's a future in which the roads, or even regardless of the roads, where electricity can be transmitted wirelessly, maybe even through the same cell towers that send people their cell phone signal, and somebody's car can be charged automatically while they're driving and never need to be recharged at all, and can keep it charged no matter where they go. And so these, again, understandings of the past, let's not only understand the present and change our perspective of the present, but also help us to predict the future. And one of the things we can learn from the past is that things that became irrelevant or less relevant oftentimes become relevant again. In 2015, bicycles outsold cars in all of Europe, right? So in Europe, they sold more bikes in that year than they sold cars. And why was that? Well, because of climate change and concerns about environmental sustainability, but also economics. Europe was having their own struggles during that time, and it was much cheaper to get a bike than it was to get a car. Again, so one of the mistakes that we make when we think about trends and when we try to predict the future is we see things constantly moving in the same direction, technology making things obsolete and those things becoming completely unnecessary. But bikes, if anything, haven't become less relevant. They've actually become more relevant, not as recreation, but as actual functional transportation. And there's places in Europe now where you see far more bikes than you do cars, not just over some brief period because of a fad or a trend, but as a way that people have started to live their lives. We're moving back to the way things used to be because the promise of some new technologies were what we thought they were, and there's advantages to older technologies that we didn't recognize until we had enough time to see them. Another example is vinyl record sales continue to have new albums on vinyl, even though you can immediately have a song electronically on your phone. There's something holding something. There's something people like about that sound, even though it has imperfections. There are factories being built even today for people to make vinyl records, even though it's a technology that was replaced by 8-tracks and then by tapes and then by CDs and then by streaming music. It isn't like it's the most recent and we're drifting back to it. We're going way back to a different technology because people are seeing advantages to it that they didn't understand until it was completely taken away. And so one of the things we can learn from the past is that just because something new takes over doesn't mean that it will stay on top forever. And just because something has been made obsolete or less relevant in the short term doesn't mean that it will disappear forever. We have to be aware of the way things change if we want to be able to predict the future. And one of the ones that I love, John Nesbitt wrote a book which was all about predicting the future called Megatrends. And one of the mega trends was what he called high tech, high touch. And this is a really important principle that I think is really useful. And I think that we don't understand very much. We talk in our society about how technology is taking over and people don't value human connections anymore. And we have to get back to connecting as individuals and as families. And we have to build on relationships and remember that people matter. And people are panicked that somehow the world is going to give up on human connection and human touch. And that's not true. What he shows is consistently, and you still see it happening to this day, is that as technology takes over and becomes more and more ingrained in our world, as it becomes more and more valuable, we actually value human connection even more than we did before. We value human contact even more than before. We value face-to-face interactions even more than we did before. This is one of the reasons for vinyl records. We value being able to, the more abstract and digital the world becomes, the more we value physical reality, the more we value being able to hold on to something. And so one of the ways that we can understand the future is to understand that reality, that people haven't given up on human contact and human connection. And in fact, you're going to see that after this global pandemic, when this is over and we can go back outside again, when this is over and we can go back to work again, when this is over and we can meet in public again, when this is over and we can go to sporting events again, there's going to be a rise in the number of people doing that. There's actually going to be a decrease in the amount of people on their phones and using their technology. There's very few people worldwide when this is over who are going to go, this is awesome. I never have to leave the house again. I'm never going to talk to another human being in person again. I'm just going to use Zoom all day. It's a perfectly satisfactory substitute for human interaction. I love it. And I'm never going back to the other way. That's not what's going to happen. There's going to be this explosion of people trying to reconnect with other people in real life. There's going to be an explosion. There's going to be a renewed appreciation of shaking someone's hand, of giving someone a hug, of sitting across from someone and sharing a meal, of sitting down in public and having a meal prepared for you by someone else. We're not we won't lose that. And this isn't an anti-technology. It's not saying the technology doesn't matter or the technology shouldn't exist, or that it's that as the technology becomes more valuable and more useful, I'm glad we have Zoom, but it isn't a replacement. The more people spend time on Zoom, the more they actually value that human connection, that human touch. So step one is to be alert. Don't be complacent. Be looking for the future. Understand the past. Don't fall into the trap of creating the same cycle over and over again. The next one is to be brave. When Elon Musk sold Zip2, he took all of that money personally. He didn't immediately get investment from other people. He took all of that money and personally invested it in the company that then became PayPal. He put his money where his mouth was. He took everything and he reinvested in something new, which if it didn't work would have taken him all the way back to having absolutely nothing. He didn't hedge his bets. He didn't spread it out and diversify it. And again, that's unusual. We taught diversification is the way to go. No, he put it all in one thing, in PayPal. And when he sold that, he put it all in Tesla. And a couple of times along the way, he's reinvested in Tesla when nobody else would, to show them that he has that confidence and he's willing to put his fortune on the line for the company that he believes in. And so why do we need to be brave, though? Why can't we just learn from the past, predict the future, and when we have a good way of doing things, why can't we just share that with the world and have them respond well? And it's because they don't. A great example is right now we're all learning or relearning, hopefully, the importance of hand washing. But a couple hundred years ago, we didn't know that hand washing was important at all. And it was a physician in Hungary named Ignaz Semmelweis in the 1800s who realized that hand washing was important. He promoted hand washing in hospital operating rooms, and he reduced the mortality rate from 35% to 1%. Now look at that, 35%. In operating rooms in the 1800s, you had a 35% chance of dying. And this primarily happened when women were having babies. The baby would die, and oftentimes the woman would die. And it's because in one room, physicians were literally learning their trade on cadavers, on dead bodies in one room. And they would walk from that room to the operating room for someone having a procedure or someone having a baby, and without washing their hands or doing anything to reduce that contamination, would just start reaching inside of that other person's body. It sounds horrific now, and it was, but back then they didn't know the difference. And this was the first person on earth to say that's a terrible idea, and maybe people wouldn't be dying at the rate that they're dying if we washed our hands. And so why do you need to be brave? Well, because what happened? Well, what happened was he conflicted with the established scientific and medical opinions of the time, and his ideas were rejected by the medical community. He was disgraced as a physician. He ended his life dying in an insane asylum with no money and with no fame and with no credit for the one idea that dramatically changed the health and safety and longevity of human beings on this earth. So we have to be brave when we're going to do things differently when times are bad. We have to be brave when we're going to do things differently when times are good, because when you do things differently, and we're going to get to that next, people will attack you. You will experience resistance. People will argue that you're wrong, and why would you do that? Because that's not what everybody does. Why don't you just lay off your workers? Why don't you just cut costs? Why don't you just cut services? One of the things that I encourage people to do, there were a lot of people from Batelco in the audience during my presentation in 2016, and what I encourage them to do is try to get as many people to provide as much good customer service as they possibly could, provide over-the-top positive customer service to try to attract as many new customers as possible, try to offer the cheapest possible plan, and position themselves as the number one service provider in Bahrain, hire all of the best people while other companies were cutting back and reducing services and providing bad service, to make an investment to lose money in the short term in order to build a loyal following over the long term. I don't know if that happened. I doubt it did, because it's really difficult to hire people when everyone else is cutting their employees. It's really hard to increase services when everyone else is cutting services. It's really hard to spend money when everyone's looking for ways to save money. We have to be brave, because you experience resistance when you try to do things differently. Robert Quinn says, deviance will always generate external pressures to conform. If you perform beyond the norms, the systems will adjust and try to make you normal. If you try to save a lot of money and put a lot of money in cash instead of investing it when times are bad, if you try to slow the growth of a company when economic times are good because you want to be cautious and you want to be ready for the next downturn, you're going to experience resistance. If you have hope when everyone is afraid, when you're afraid, when everyone has hope, if you perform beyond the norms, the systems will adjust and try to make you normal. Deviance will always generate external pressures to conform. And so leaders have to have the courage to resist those external pressures to conform and to do things in an unusual way during unusual times. Gandhi's a great example of the consequences of this. He's widely considered by many people worldwide to be one of the greatest leaders in the history of the world, and yet he was assassinated because people loved him tremendously, and other people hated him so much they wanted him to die. Albert Einstein said, great spirits have always experienced violent opposition from mediocre minds, right? When you try to do things the status quo, when you don't just do things the way that everyone else does them. Think about that guy, the Gravity Payments CEO, when he announced that he was going to pay everybody $70,000. There's really no reason to criticize somebody for that. It's his company. He can do what he wants. And he believed that taking good care of his employees was going to pay off for him in the long run. And the amount of negative press, the amount of criticism that he received for that, the number of personal attacks that he faced for just paying people more money, paying his own employees more money. He wasn't promoting universal basic income or telling the government to do something. He just took the money that he made and his company and gave more of it to his employees. And some people just told him he was the worst human being on earth. Great spirits have always experienced violent opposition from mediocre minds. When you try to do things differently, when you challenge this status quo, it takes courage, because you're going to experience resistance. If we want to be influential as leaders, we have to be willing to at least risk, if not experience, suffering. We have to be willing to make sacrifices. There's CEOs right now during this economic downturn who have cut their salary to $0 or to $1 so that their company has more money to pay their employees when their income has been either eliminated or decreased dramatically. What kind of loyalty, again, does that create when we behave differently at the bottom? When things start to turn around, what kind of loyalty have we created with our employees? What kind of reputation have we created for our company? And the lie we've been told is that our influence can increase dramatically without any sacrifice, and that's simply just not true. That's not possible, and that's why it takes courage to lead during these times of crisis. So one of the things I've learned from studying leadership, my doctorate's in management leadership, I wrote a book called The 4 Factors of Effective Leadership, is that the difference between great leaders and terrible leaders is that great leaders endure suffering and terrible leaders inflict suffering. Right? Great leaders endure suffering. They're willing to experience that personal pain. They're willing to cut back. They're willing to live with less. They're willing to take criticism. They're willing to lose money financially. And what terrible leaders do is someone has to suffer. Someone has to lose in a crisis like this, lose their health. In a crisis like this, lose their money. But terrible leaders say, well, that's not going to be me. Someone else is going to get sick. I'm going to protect myself. Someone else needs to be doing the work, but I'm going to go home. Someone else has to, lose their job or take a pay cut, but I need to continue getting paid because I'm the valuable one in this scenario. And so that's one of my challenges to you right now. Are we brave enough? Do we have enough courage to voluntarily sacrifice our own safety, our own comfort, our own security for the sake of the people that we're supposed to be leading, the people we're supposed to be serving? What am I willing to sacrifice in order to increase my influence? The next thing we need to do is to be different. Again, Elon Musk is an amazing example of this. He sells electric cars at Tesla instead of gas-powered cars. That's not just a little different. It's incredibly different. He has a prepay model, as we already talked about, whereas car companies, again, go in the completely the opposite direction, where they offer financing and they make most of their money through the financing, not through the sale of the actual vehicle. He's working on self-driving and autonomous cars and autonomous aspects of existing cars instead of relying on a human driver. The cars can be updated constantly as they're made and even after you've taken them away, using computer software instead of yearly sporadic updates like the 2019 model, the 2020 model of a car. Tesla doesn't do that. They're constantly updating and selling you the best possible car they can and giving you any kind of software updates that they can make along the way, just like your computer, to improve it constantly. With Solar City, they're offering free charging for people who have Tesla cars instead of very high cost gasoline for regular cars. At SpaceX, they're a private company doing what only public institutions used to be able to do, like national space programs. They're doing things privately when no one thought that was possible. They're reusing rockets and other parts and equipment instead of making them disposable. And that disposability was precisely what made it so costly when they got started. And a great example of this is what we started with, talking about the 2007 financial crisis. The Dow Jones was at 14,164. It went down to 6,507. That's a loss of 54%. It's a loss of $10 trillion in value, right? But there was a guy during that time, everybody didn't lose money because some people did things differently. And there was a guy named Mike Burry, and he had his own investment company, and he read the documents that no one else was reading. He asked the questions that no one else was asking. He was concerned about a bubble, and he was concerned about a crisis when no one else was. And when everyone was making tons of money going into the crisis, he was buying insurance against the crisis because he knew it was all a lie. He knew it was all fake. He knew it was all going to crash. And during the crash where the Dow Jones lost 54% and $10 trillion, his fund went up 490%, and he made more than $1 billion for his clients. Now, we just talked about being brave. He had clients who were so unhappy with him along the way that they were suing him to get their money back because they thought he was on the wrong track, until he made them 490% and made them $1 billion. And he said this, he said, to succeed in a spectacular fashion, you have to be spectacularly unusual, right? And that's my challenge to you today. Are you willing to be spectacularly unusual in order to succeed in a spectacular fashion? Another good example of this is Warren Buffett. Warren Buffett is now worth $72 billion, and that's after giving away half of his fortune and having it all grow back again through investments over time. And what he did during the last financial crisis was bought a lot of companies or significant stakes in a lot of companies at pennies on the dollar, because they said Warren Buffett is famous for predicting 5 of the last 2 recessions, right? He's always concerned about the next downturn. He saves cash for the next downturn, and then when it happens, he buys things at pennies on the dollar, makes a tremendous amount of money as things improve, takes a lot of cash out to be ready for the next one, and he keeps doing this over and over and over again, and he ends up winning. Now, sometimes he is too conservative, but that doesn't cost him in the long run, because it's better to be over-prepared for bad times than to assume they'll never happen. And what he said is that we need to be fearful when others are greedy and be greedy when others are fearful. And so I'm actually going to stop right there. There's a little bit more that we could talk about, but I want to stop right there because I want to leave a little bit of time for questions, and I want to stop right there to talk about this a little bit and to really leave this as the last thing. He says, be fearful when others are greedy, and this is really bringing back together everything we've talked about at this point. And there's 2 primary things that I want to encourage you to think about doing right now and to make sure that you're doing as things begin to turn around. He says, be fearful when others are greedy. What does that mean? He means when things are going well and everyone else is trying to find a way to maximize their profits and maximize their investments and benefit from some kind of gold rush, some kind of get rich quick sort of a thing, what he wants you to do is be a little bit afraid. Why do you need to be afraid? Well, remember, step one, we said be alert. Don't be complacent. Be concerned about that next potential downturn. When everything is going great, be fearful. When others are greedy, save more money, and be ready for things to go bad. But then also be greedy when others are fearful. So what he's saying is, for times like right now, be greedy, right? Go out there and buy something. Go out there and invest. Be a person who's looking to take advantage of this situation, not to take advantage of people, but to take advantage of the situation. And one thing I want you to think about, and I'd really love for you to do, is to go hire people right now. And you might say, Dave, I don't have money. Well, first of all, money's cheaper right now in most places than it's ever been before. Make that investment if you really believe, and you should, based on the past, that things are going to turn around. Go hire people. The best people are available right now because they're just today in the United States, we had another 6 million unemployment claims. There are good people out there, not because they're unemployed, not because they're bad people, but because the economy turned down. There are good people who are available right now, and you can pay them a reasonable salary and they'll be excited to work for you. And then when things turn around, you're going to have a loyal employee, and you're also going to have a better employee than when you're trying to find employees when unemployment's really low. Be fearful when others are greedy. Be greedy when others are fearful. If we're really alert and we understand the future by understanding the past, if we have the courage to do things differently, and then we actually do things differently, we're going to have success in times of crisis because we're going to be ready for that crisis, and we're going to behave differently than everyone else does during that crisis. All right, so we have a couple minutes left. I want to take a minute here to open things up for questions, and I'm happy to stay around as long as you are. So, Mohammed, do you know if we have any? Do we have any questions? Okay, so I see one here from Mahmoud. He said, is this corona issue a recession? Well, I don't know that it's a recession yet. There's technical and mathematical formulas that go into that. And that's, I think, part of the question. Are things going to turn around fairly quickly if people get healthy and if we're able to use social distancing to stop this? Or is this going to turn into a recession? And it's hard to know. It's hard to know how long the effects are going to last, how quickly people will be able to turn this around. So like, let's say for me in my business, I can't do my presentations on stages and at conferences like I used to because people can't meet together. But it won't just turn around immediately, because once people can legally and safely meet together again, a lot of companies and organizations are going to be struggling financially and maybe not invest in those events like they used to. And so I think there is a good chance that this will get worse before it gets better. And I don't know that we know exactly how long it will take for things to turn around. And that's, again, going back to what I said about predicting these kinds of things. That's why we should probably save more money than we do during the good times, both personally and in our businesses. And we just tend not to. Governments definitely don't either. And so I think one of the things we want to do is run our lives and run our businesses in a way that we can weather recessions, that we can last through recessions, that we don't have to worry about it as much. Another question there is, what is your recommendations for family offices? I'd need a little more information on that question to be able to answer that. I'm not sure exactly what you mean for family offices. Could you please name a few examples for great leaders and a few others for terrible leaders other than Elon Musk and Gandhi? Well, the terrible leaders are people like Stalin, from a political standpoint, people who murdered their people, people who terrorized their own people, people who took advantage of their own people to line their own pockets. We still see that today with governments and with leaders around the world. And for good leaders, there's all sorts. I mean, Martin Luther King Jr. is another good example. people who basically it's anyone who was willing to endure suffering in order to help their people to escape oppression, who sacrificed their own interests for the interests of others. Mother Teresa wasn't a political leader, but I think she's a great example of leadership because she consistently sacrificed herself for others and then ended up having a tremendous amount of political influence. Leaders all over the world wanted to talk to her and learn from her because her way of doing things was so much different. Reem's got a good question. I still don't understand the concept of investing when I have no money, right? So two things. Number one, like I said, capital becomes really inexpensive during times like this. At least in some parts of the world, governments are trying to make money available and interest rates are going down. And so it becomes a question of taking a chance, right? It's making a bet, just like when Warren Buffett buys things at a low price. But it's a fair question. If you actually don't have the money, you can't do that. And that's part of what I'm saying is when times are good, when things turn around, you don't have money now. When things turn around, save more money, put more money to the side, keep more money in cash, waiting for that next downturn so that when things drop down, you do have money when things get bad, if that makes sense. So you're right. I didn't put enough money in savings, so I'm not really in a position to invest right now. However, I am keeping on my employees because I don't want them to suffer during this time. And so I'm taking a financial hit in order to do that. But if I would have put aside more money when times were good, when my business was going well, when my keynotes were going well, I could invest right now. So yeah, I'm not telling you to make bad decisions or do something that's impossible, but for companies and for businesses, and often sometimes for individuals, you can borrow the money in order to make investments during this particular time. I don't encourage people to do that as individuals. That's incredibly dangerous. But as businesses, we can invest in our people. Even Muhammad, I mean, he's seeing a dramatic decrease in training because what do we cut back on when times are tough? We cut back on training. But what do our people have time for when there's cutbacks? People have time for training. The demands of the job aren't as high. And so we have more time to do training during these kinds of times. We have more time to show people that they're valuable to us. But again, to Reem's point, that costs money. We have to be willing to make that investment when times are difficult so that our people are better prepared to succeed on the other side. How do you keep a team who are away from home and unsure of the future motivated? Well, I think that's one of the things. Hopefully some of these examples have helped with that. The way you motivate people is you remind people that things are tough, but things are going to turn around. Things aren't going to be easy for a while, but it's going to be worth it. I think you have to go back to the purpose of why your organization exists, of why your company exists. And you have to stay in communication with people. You have to answer their questions, and you have to look for ways to give them that hope and to reassure them. And one of the ways to do that is to share those stories and examples of past crises and past problems and the way governments, countries, companies, and people have recovered from those, to remind people that this isn't the end. This isn't the last one. This isn't the one that ends the world. We're going to come out the other side of this. And then the other thing I would tell you is get them involved. Ask them questions. Remember the example I gave at the beginning of the Gravity CEO asking his employees, how should we handle this downturn? He got some good ideas that were able to preserve people's jobs and also get people involved in the process. So I think the more control you can give people of the process and of the business, that helps people handle things even when everything seems out of control, if you can get them involved and give them opportunities for participation. So somebody said, being inspiring, could you touch on this briefly? I kind of already have. We just started talking about it. Inspiration is about reminding people about the purpose of what they do, the meaning about what they do, the value of what they do. A way we inspire people is by being a CEO inspires his people or her people when he cuts his salary to zero, so that those people can get paid. A CEO inspires his people when he continues to pay them even when the company's income has been reduced dramatically. He or she inspires their people when they don't lay people off, but they give people an opportunity to take voluntary pay cuts. We inspire people when we are willing to endure difficulty on their behalf, but also when we give people hope, when we remind people that things will improve, that things will turn around. We inspire people when we go against all of the negativity and the fear and the panic, and we assure them that together we can come through this crisis and be stronger than we were before. We inspire people when we invest in their training and when we invest in their development during difficult times, when we're flexible and give them opportunities to work in unusual ways. We inspire them when we come up with ways to do business that are completely different. Some companies in the US are transitioning to making medical supplies when that wasn't their original business. And so looking for ways to do those things are ways to inspire people. Are there any tips on how to keep people focused on an objective when issues back home are dominating people's thoughts? So I think you're fighting a losing battle there. I think what you want to do there is let those issues dominate people's thoughts for a while. Give people opportunities to talk about those thoughts. If you keep trying to push people back towards the objective when people are experiencing tremendous personal disruption, you're just fighting a losing battle. So what I think you do is you actually give in to that and you look for ways to foster that. You schedule Zoom meetings just for those kinds of things. You offer people assistance with those things. You talk to people personally about those things. You allow teams time and energy to put into those things. You give people resources and a platform to have those discussions because they need to. They need to work through those things. And you're never going to get them back on the objective until you allow them to work through that process. So I think instead of fighting it, I think you see that part of your job during a crisis is to help people emotionally, physically, psychologically, spiritually deal with the crisis that they're experiencing, and to acknowledge that it is very difficult to do your job when you're feeling like, this is the end of the world and we might not come out of this. And I'm worried about the health of my loved ones. We just have to give people time to process that and recognize that there's no way for them to continue on without doing that. We're back to the family stuff. Who manage investment funds for a large family? What's the recommendation for their investment plans during times like this? So again, I think communication and looking at history. Sit people down when you're managing their money and talk to them about the history of investments and talk to them about the ups and downs from the past. Talk to them about what the future probably looks like. And in most cases, I would tell you to try to calm them down and keep them from panicking and making bad decisions right now that are going to keep them from benefiting from the coming upswing. And again, it comes to not so much giving advice, but focusing on realities, showing people actual data from the past about how things go down and then they come back up, and asking people potentially if they want to. I'll give you an example personally. I bought an investment at $27 a share back right before the global financial crisis. The value of that stock went down to $6 a share. So it lost, massive amount of value. And what did I do? I bought more shares at 6 instead of selling them all at 6. And that stock has since come up to go past 27. And I made a lot of money for my retirement fund because I didn't panic and I actually saw opportunities when things got bad. And so that's what I would encourage people to think about. It doesn't mean we have to even make those huge investments, but at the very least, we should resist that urge to start selling everything off. The time to take out cash is when things are going well and when things are going up, not when things are going down. That's my general advice, and I think history supports that. I'm not going to talk about Bitcoin because I'm not an expert in that, and I don't want to give people bad advice. I don't know enough about that, and so I won't discuss that. We noticed a lot of meetings to assess the problem. What are the top three issues that we need to think about. The top three issues I think you need to think about go back to some of the things that people already asked about. I think the number one thing to think about during times like this is the psychological and emotional and physical health of your people, of your family, and also of your employees. Survival of your business and survival of your people. And those personal relationships, I think, are the most important thing, and everything else can be built on that foundation. If we talk too much about the business, people just can't even hear it right now. They just can't pay attention to it. I mean, and this is just fundamental psychology. I mean, if you're being chased by a wild animal that has the ability to kill you, and you're listening to an audiobook on your iPhone, your brain is not processing anything that's coming through the audio on that iPhone, because your brain in times of potential death and survival only focuses on survival. So to try to get people to just ignore what's happening and quote unquote focus on their work or focus on the business is only going to be successful if you can help them to process those feelings and those emotions and those fears. And if you can give them real inspiration, if you can show them that you're willing to suffer with them, if you can show them that it's not going to be easy, but it's going to be worth it, if you can give them hope, if you can. So I think the other one is you have to not just give people hope, you have to have a plan. So I think the other three things of the three that you need to be talking about is, okay, things can get better, but how do we help make that possible? For example, I started doing better with this crisis when I sat down with my personal finances and started cutting unnecessary costs. It felt good and it felt better to be doing something and to say, okay, one of my goals is to reduce unnecessary expenses right now. But again, back to the point of my presentation, I didn't cut my employees because I don't want to harm them financially during this time, and I'm willing to take on that burden. And back to the earlier question from somebody, how do you make investments when you don't have money? I'll be borrowing the money to pay my employees for a little while. I'll be taking on debt that I think I can afford to take on more than they can, instead of cutting their jobs and having them potentially not be able to feed their families. And so part of the way that I'm doing that is through debt. Now, what should I have done? I should have saved up more during the good times so that I was more ready for the bad times. And that's part of what I'm preaching. All right, coronavirus triggered financial crisis. Given such a trigger but prolonged effect, do you think finding a breakthrough against COVID will be the kickstart to get back to normal, or do you think that it's just no longer just a corona problem? Well, you're right. It's a great analysis. It's no longer just a corona problem. It's become a systemic issue. But I do think anything that can be done to fight not just even this disease, but to put systems in place to respond better next time, both to the treatment needs and things like that, but also to find cures faster, to create testing faster. And so that's a great example that there's huge potential. If you are anywhere near science, if you are anywhere near medical services, and you can look at building a company that can be ready for the next one, prepare the world for the next one, respond quicker to the next one. If your company does anything like transportation or distribution or manufacturing, looking for ways to, because there are plenty of businesses that aren't struggling right now. If you're in the healthcare business right now, you're doing great. Netflix is doing great. Zoom is doing great. Everybody isn't losing right now. And so, yes, I think that a breakthrough against COVID-19 will kickstart the recovery. It will take a while for that to cascade back out through the rest of the economy. But I think if the disease keeps spreading and we can't get it under control, this is just going to last longer. The effects are going to be deeper, and it's going to take longer to recover. I think ultimately there has to be health improvements. Social distancing has to start working. We need a vaccine, or we need to know that we have the medical supplies that we need in order to manage the process. And then people will start going back to work and start going back to life as normal. And then we got one more here. I wonder if the GCC region will hold strong in their drive towards 2030 or simply move the date to the right. If they want to remain on course, then don't you think they need to accelerate training upskilling? Absolutely, Robert. Now's the time to train people. Now's the time to give people new skills. Now's the time to invest in people. Now's the time to develop people. That's exactly what I've been saying. Now's not the time to send people home and have people sitting around unemployed and not learning anything. And now's the time to, and now's the time to make that investment. When the demands of industry aren't so high that there's no time for that, when the demand isn't so high that people have to constantly be working in order to produce the things that are necessary, that's the time to develop people. So I think, yes, now is the time for training. And again, that's an investment. It's difficult to make because we say, well, we don't have the money. But again, we always have money for things that we think really matter. And if you thought things were going to turn around, if you know things are going to turn around, or if you realize the only way to get things to turn around is to give people the skills, imagine if Bahrain says that they're going to be the center of the response to the next global pandemic, and they're going to build a country that is ready to save the rest of the world the next time this happens. I guarantee you people will give you money for that. I guarantee you people will invest in that. I guarantee people will invest in a business that does that, and you could probably start that process right now and see a tremendous amount of not just local investment and government investment, but foreign investment. So I think, yes, now is the time to train and upskill people. And maybe one of the ways to promote that is to be training and upskilling people in things in and around medical, transportation, medical supplies, scientific research, et cetera. And again, now is the time to do it. Not waiting until things are turning around and everyone's moving in that direction. All right, I think that runs through the questions I've got here in the Q&A, and we've gone quite a bit over our time. Thank you for everything. Thank you for all the questions. Hopefully this has been useful. I'll make sure Mohammed has